In the last days of April of 1945, Benito Mussolini no longer was the dictator that had controlled Italy with a hand of iron. He tried to escape toward the Swiss border, hidden among a German convoy. He was discovered and detained by partisans in a small town on the shores of the Lake of Como. At his side was Clara Petacci, who refused to abandon him. The Duce, who had created a totalitarian regime, signed the Pact of Steel with Hitler and dragged Italy to the war, was reduced to a prisoner without power nor army that defended him. In a matter of hours, his destiny was sealed. Who took really the decision to finish with Mussolini? Was it immediate justice or political vengeance? And what historical meaning had the end of Mussolini for the Axis? Absolute power, the rise and fall of the Duces. The 30th of October of 1922, Benito Mussolini became Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Italy after the so-called March on Rome. The decision it was taken by the King Victor Emmanuel III when thousands of fascist militants mobilized toward the capital as a demonstration of force. Although the real number of participants was limited, the political pressure and the threat of civil war influenced in the decision of the monarch to reject the state of siege and entrust to Mussolini the formation of the government. In his first cabinet, Mussolini governed in coalition with conservative and liberal forces. However, from the beginning he sought to expand the competences of the executive. In 1923 was approved the Acerbo law that granted to the most voted list in elections at least 2/3 of the seats in the Chamber of Deputies. With this mechanism, the National Fascist Party secured a parliamentary majority in the elections of 1924. That same year occurred the assassination of the socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti, critic of the regime and of the electoral irregularities. Although the direct responsibility of Mussolini was not proven, the fact provoked a political crisis known as the Matteotti scandal. Part of the opposition abandoned the parliament as a sign of protest, facilitating for the head of government to maneuver to consolidate control. Between 1925 and 1926, a series of decrees and laws known as the Fascistissime laws transformed the political system. Were dissolved all the opposition parties, were prohibited the free unions, were suppressed the freedoms of press and assembly, and was created a special tribunal for the defense of the state. The voluntary militia for national security, formed by the Black Shirts, became an auxiliary force of the army. Toward 1926, the regime had established a single-party system under the undisputed leadership of Mussolini. In 1929, the Italian state signed the Lateran Pacts with the Holy See. These agreements resolved the Roman question, in effect since 1870, after the annexation of the Pontifical States. The Vatican was recognized as an independent state and received indemnities, while Catholicism became the official religion of Italy. This assured the neutrality of the Church toward the regime and strengthened the legitimacy of the fascist government. In parallel, the regime promoted a corporate economic model. The Charter of Labor of 1927 proclaimed that labor relations would be regulated by corporations that grouped workers and employers under state supervision. The objective was to substitute the class struggle with collaboration directed from the state. Corporatism became one of the most prominent institutional features of the fascist system. During the Great Depression, Italy faced bank failures, a fall in exports, and an increase in unemployment. In 1933 was created the Institute for Industrial Reconstruction, which assumed control of strategic companies in banking, transport, and communications. This turned the state into one of the main actors of the national economy. In the monetary sphere was promoted the battle of the lira to maintain exchange stability. In agriculture, campaigns like the Battle of the Wheat sought to increase food self-sufficiency. On the social level, the regime promoted youth and women's organizations to indoctrinate the population under fascist principles. Education was restructured with emphasis on loyalty to the state, obedience, and nationalism. The cult of the figure of Mussolini as Duce was spread through propaganda, parades, and controlled press. Foreign policy sought to position Italy as a Mediterranean power. In 1935, the Italian army invaded Ethiopia, using modern weaponry and aerial means. The League of Nations condemned the aggression and applied economic sanctions, but without effective military measures. In 1936, Italy proclaimed the annexation of the territory and declared the birth of the empire. That same year, Mussolini intervened in the Spanish Civil War in support of Francisco Franco, sending troops, airplanes, and supplies. In 1939, Italy occupied Albania, reinforcing its presence in the Balkans. The rapprochement with Nazi Germany intensified after 1936. Mussolini adopted policies similar to those of Hitler, including the racial laws of 1938 that excluded Jews from public and professional life. In 1939, Italy and Germany signed the Pact of Steel, committing to mutual assistance in case of war. When the war broke out in September of 1939, Italy initially declared itself non-belligerent. Mussolini hoped that the conflict would be prolonged to gain time and prepare. However, after the rapid German victories over Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands and France, he decided to intervene. The 10th of June of 1940, Italy declared war on France and the United Kingdom. The initial operations were limited. In the Western Alps, the Italian troops advanced few kilometers against France, which was already practically defeated by Germany. In the Mediterranean, the Italian Navy faced difficulties against the Royal Navy. In the north of Africa, the Italian forces invaded Egypt from Libya, but were repelled by the British, who counterattacked and occupied extensive areas of Cyrenaica. In October of 1940, Mussolini ordered the invasion of Greece from Albania without consulting Hitler. The campaign resulted in failure. The Greek army resisted and counterattacked, penetrating into Albanian territory. Germany intervened in April of 1941 to secure the Balkans, forcing Italy to accept a subordinate position in military operations. In North Africa, after the initial setbacks, Italy depended increasingly on German support. In 1941 was created the Africa Corps under the command of Erwin Rommel, which operated alongside the Italian troops. Although they obtained some victories, like the capture of Tobruk in 1942, the strategic situation became unsustainable. In November of 1942, the Allied landing in the north of Africa and the defeat at El Alamein marked a turning point. On the Eastern Front, Mussolini sent a contingent to the service of Germany. The Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, deployed in 1941, was expanded in 1942 until forming the Italian Army in Russia. Poorly equipped for the extreme climate, it suffered serious losses during the Soviet offensive at Stalingrad and the Don. More than half of its personnel were killed, wounded, or captured. The military defeats, the bombings over Italian cities, and the economic scarcity deteriorated the internal situation. Discontent grew in the population and also in sectors of the regime. In July of 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. The Italian defense collapsed rapidly, while the German forces fell back to contain the advance. In this context, the night of the 24th to the 25th of July of 1943 met in Rome the Grand Council of Fascism, an organ that had not convened since 1939. Dino Grandi presented a motion that returned to the king the headship of the armed forces. The proposal was approved with 19 votes in favor, 8 against, and 1 abstention. The 25th of July, Mussolini went to his usual audience with Victor Emmanuel III at Villa Savoia. The monarch dismissed him and communicated to him that he had named Pietro Badoglio as the new president of the Council of Ministers. Upon leaving the meeting, Mussolini was arrested by the Carabinieri and transferred initially to the Podgora barracks. The fascist regime ceased to exist as an autonomous power structure. Badoglio announced that the war would continue alongside Germany, but in secret, he initiated contacts with the Allies to negotiate an armistice. Gran Sasso, the impossible rescue of Mussolini. After the dismissal of Benito Mussolini the 25th of July of 1943, the new head of government Pietro Badoglio and the King Victor Emmanuel III decided to isolate him in different places to avoid liberation attempts. First, he was transferred to the island of Ponza, then to La Maddalena in Sardinia, and finally, at the beginning of September of 1943, to the Hotel Campo Imperatore, situated in the massif of the Gran Sasso in the Abruzzi Apennines. The place was chosen for its geographical isolation. It was located at more than 2,000 meters of altitude and was only accessible by means of a cable car. The security was the responsibility of Carabinieri and Italian military units. During his confinement, Mussolini showed signs of physical deterioration with health problems reported by his custodians. Despite the surveillance, he remained partially informed of the situation through the Italian officers who guarded him. For Adolf Hitler, the fall of his main ally in the south of Europe represented a strategic and symbolic risk. From the 25th of July, he ordered the intelligence service and the SS to locate Mussolini. The Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst tracked the different places where he had been transferred until confirming that he was in the Gran Sasso. The decision to liberate him was taken immediately by Hitler, who considered it necessary to restore the Duce in some type of authority to maintain an Italy aligned with the Axis. The one in charge of planning the operation was General Kurt Student, a specialist in airborne troops, while the execution was assigned to a mixed command of paratroopers and SS agents directed by Otto Skorzeny. The operation received the code name Eiche, which means oak. The 12th of September of 1943, a group of 90 German paratroopers, together with 12 SS agents under the command of Skorzeny, carried out the mission. They used DFS 230 gliders that landed on the esplanade next to the Hotel Campo Imperatore, bypassing the Italian defenses. The action was rapid. The Carabinieri in charge of the custody did not offer significant resistance after receiving contradictory orders from Rome and due to the evident superiority of fire of the Germans. Skorzeny and the paratroopers burst into the hotel and found Mussolini in his room. The Duce was liberated without shots or serious confrontations. He was escorted to a Fieseler 156 Storch airplane piloted by Gerhard Fieseler and transferred first to Pratica di Mare, near Rome, and then to Vienna. The success of the operation was widely disseminated by German propaganda as an example of military efficacy. After the rescue, Mussolini was taken to Germany. The 14th of September of 1943, he met with Hitler in Rastenburg, East Prussia, at the general headquarters known as the Wolf's Lair. In that meeting, Mussolini initially expressed his desire to retire from political life. However, Hitler presented to him the necessity of forming a new fascist government in the north of Italy, under German occupation. Hitler communicated to him that the surrender signed by Badoglio with the Allies was unacceptable for Germany, and that the Italian territories under German control had to be kept within the war effort of the Axis. Faced with this pressure, Mussolini accepted to head the structure that would be known as the Italian Social Republic. The 23rd of September of 1943, Mussolini publicly announced the creation of the new state, whose administrative capital was fixed in Salò on the shores of the Lake of Garda. From there comes the name with which the regime is known, Republic of Salò. The territory under control of the RS1 was limited to the north and part of the center of Italy, while the south was already under Allied occupation. Although formally it presented itself as a sovereign state, in practice it depended totally on the German forces, which maintained military and administrative control. The new government was composed of fascist hierarchs who had remained loyal to Mussolini. Alessandro Pavolini was named secretary of the new Republican Fascist Party. Rodolfo Graziani, a former marshal, assumed command of the armed forces of the RSI, which were organized under strict German supervision. The Italian Social Republic adopted an ideological program that insisted on the social dimension of fascism. In the Manifesto of Verona, published in November of 1943, was proclaimed the abolition of the monarchy, the establishment of a popular republic based on corporate principles, and an economic policy of nationalizations. In practice, these measures had scarce application. The German priority was to secure military logistics and repress the partisan resistance. The forces of the RS1 collaborated in operations against insurgents and in deportations of Jews toward Nazi concentration camps. Mussolini installed himself with his entourage in Gargnano, in a villa on the shores of the Lake of Garda. From there, he supervised in a limited manner the governmental activities. His communications were controlled by German officers and his margin of decision was reduced. The real control over the Republic of Salò was in the hands of the SS, directed in Italy by Karl Wolff, supreme commander of the SS and the police in the country. Wolff coordinated the repression against partisans and the persecution of opponents. The Gestapo also maintained a direct presence, intervening in detentions and deportations. Mussolini, unlike his previous stage in power, no longer had capacity for independent maneuver. His speeches were supervised and his image used for propagandistic purposes by Berlin. Diplomatic correspondence and military decisions were taken in obligatory consultation with the Germans. Reports from the era reflect that the former leader was in a situation of isolation, surrounded by a small circle of collaborators and constantly watched. His role was reduced to giving formal legitimacy to a government imposed by the military occupation. Clara Petacci, who had been Mussolini's lover since the beginning of the decade of 1930, remained at his side during this period. After the rescue at the Gran Sasso, she sought to reunite with him in Germany and subsequently in Salo. The Petacci family benefited from her closeness with Mussolini. Her father, Francesco Petacci, a doctor of the Vatican, received protection. Her brother Marcello participated in activities related to the regime, and Clara herself resided in villas near the Lake of Garda, from where she maintained direct contact with the Duce. Various contemporary sources document that Clara maintained a constant relationship with Mussolini in these years, accompanying him in displacements and acting as a confidant. Despite the atmosphere of hostility and the ongoing war, she did not separate from him. Between the end of 1943 and 1945, the Italian peninsula became an active front of the Second World War. To the south, the Allies advanced slowly toward Rome and later toward the Po Valley. To the north, the partisans intensified the resistance against the German troops and the forces of the RSI. The Army of the Republic of Salo officially had more than 300,000 men, but it suffered from desertions and lacked modern weaponry. In many operations, it depended directly on German support. The National Republican Guard and the Black Brigades acted as forces of internal repression against partisans and civilians suspected of collaborating with the resistance. The RSI faced difficulties from the beginning. The abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a republican regime failed to attract popular sectors. The majority of the population saw the new state as a prolongation of the German occupation. The Republican Fascist Party tried to recover militancy, but its activities were limited in large measure to propaganda. There were also internal tensions between veteran fascist hierarchs and the German authorities, who imposed their criteria in all important decisions. In January of 1944 were held trials in Verona against former hierarchs who had voted against Mussolini in the Grand Council of Fascism in July of 1943. Among the condemned was Galeazzo Ciano, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and son-in-law of the Duce. He was executed by firing squad along with other high officials in an attempt to reaffirm the authority of the new regime. The Mussolini of the Republic of Salo did not exercise the same degree of initiative as in the stage from 1922 to 1923-1943. His speeches, although transmitted by radio and reproduced in the press, had less impact on a population worn out by the war. The war in Italy advanced toward the north, and the territory under control of the RISY was progressively reduced. The cities suffered constant bombings, communications were fragmented, and the state apparatus was fragile. Mussolini himself expressed in private conversations doubts about the viability of continuing, although publicly he maintained the tone of resistance. The military situation deteriorated with each month that passed. The Lake of Como, the last flight of the dictator. In the spring of 1945, the military situation in Italy became unsustainable for the Italian Social Republic. The Allied forces, after advancing from the south, had crossed the River Po and were close to occupying the north of the peninsula. The 25th of April, the Committee of National Liberation of Italy called for a general insurrection against the fascist and German forces. In Milan, Turin and other industrial cities, the partisans occupied strategic points and declared the liberation. That same day, Mussolini maintained contacts with fascist hierarchs and German authorities. Various alternatives were discussed: to resist in the Alpine region, to negotiate a partial armistice, or to flee. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, military chief of the RSI, manifested his willingness to negotiate with the Allies, while the German representatives pressed for maintaining the resistance. Mussolini evaluated the option of heading to Switzerland with the hope of obtaining political asylum. This possibility was discussed with his immediate companions, among them his lover Clara Petacci and some ministers. The idea of installing a last military redoubt in the Alps was considered but soon discarded for inviability. The final decision was to flee toward the Swiss border, situated a few kilometers to the north of the Lake of Como. The flight began the 25th of April at night. Mussolini left Milan by automobile, accompanied by Clara Petacci, her brother Marcello, and some collaborators. The next day, he joined a German military convoy commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Otto Kuhn and the Hauptsturmführer of the SS Fritz Birze. The group belonged to the SS division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, which was retreating toward the north. The convoy was composed of around 30 vehicles, including trucks, automobiles, and motorcycles. It transported both German soldiers and fascist hierarchs who sought to escape the Allied advance and the partisan insurrection. Among the Italians present figured Alessandro Pavolini, secretary of the Republican Fascist Party, Fernando Mezzasoma, Minister of Popular Culture, and other high officials. Mussolini traveled disguised with a German uniform of the Luftwaffe and a steel helmet with the purpose of passing unnoticed among the retreating troops. Clara Petacci, who insisted on accompanying him, was dressed in civilian clothes. The plan was to head toward the north, reach the Lake of Como, and from there try to cross to Switzerland. The convoy advanced slowly due to the congestion of the roads, where German units in retreat, civilian refugees, and columns of partisans were mixed. On several occasions it was stopped at improvised checkpoints, but the German officers managed to continue the march, showing credentials or negotiating passage. The 26th of April, the column crossed the localities of Como and Menaggio. There began to circulate rumors about the presence of Mussolini in the convoy. Several witnesses claimed to have recognized some fascist hierarchs. The news reached partisan groups in the area who established control posts around the town of Dongo on the western bank of the Lake of Como. The morning of the 27th of April, the convoy was stopped in Dongo by the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, a communist partisan unit commanded by Urbano Lazzaro, known as Bill. The partisans had received information that high-ranking fascists were trying to escape toward Switzerland. The vehicles were surrounded and the occupants forced to descend. The partisans quickly identified several hierarchs of the RSAD, among them Pavolini and Mezzasoma. Mussolini, dressed in a German uniform, remained in a truck and tried to hide among the soldiers. Urbano Lazzaro and other combatants began to inspect the passengers. According to the later testimony of Lazzaro, the presence of a man who avoided speaking and kept his gaze low caught his attention. After observing him closely, he recognized the Duce. The helmet and the uniform did not manage to completely hide his features. Mussolini was invited to get out of the vehicle. He offered no resistance and let himself be led by the partisans. Shortly after, Clara Petacci was also detained, who had traveled in another automobile. Both were separated from the rest of the convoy and placed under custody in Dongo. After the detentions, a negotiation began between the partisans and the German officers who commanded the convoy. The Germans demanded the liberation of their soldiers and the handover of the Italians in exchange for allowing the passage of the column. After discussions, it was agreed that the Germans could continue toward the north, while the fascists would be retained by the partisans. This agreement reflected the difference of interests between the retreating forces. For the Germans, the priority was to save their troops; for the partisans, to prevent the fascist hierarchs from escaping. In this way, Mussolini and his companions were left definitively under the control of the Italian resistance. The news of the detention of Mussolini was transmitted rapidly to Milan, where the Committee of National Liberation had assumed power after the insurrection. The clandestine radio broadcast the news to the rest of the country, generating great expectation. The partisans in Dongo, conscious of the political value of their prisoner, reinforced the surveillance. Mussolini was transferred first to the town hall of the town and then to different houses in the area to avoid rescue attempts. Clara Petacci insisted on remaining beside him, although on occasions they were separated for security reasons. The other fascist hierarchs captured in the convoy also remained prisoners. Many of them would be executed in the following days by order of the Committee of Liberation. In the afternoon of the 27th and the morning of the 28th of April, Mussolini was transferred by the partisans from Dongo toward the locality of Mezzagra on the bank of the lake. The movement sought to keep him isolated and under control while his destiny was decided. At that moment, there was still uncertainty about the course to follow. Some partisan leaders raised the possibility of a public trial, while others defended an immediate execution to avoid any German or Allied rescue attempt. The itinerary that had begun as an escape plan towards Switzerland ended in the capture without resistance in a small town on the shores of the Lake of Como. In the hands of the resistance, the final hours of Mussolini. The 27th of April of 1945, after being detained in Dongo by the partisans of the 52 Garibaldi Brigade, Mussolini was separated from the German convoy with which he was trying to flee towards Switzerland. The ex-dictator travelled disguised with a uniform of a German soldier of the Luftwaffe, but the detailed inspection carried out by the partisans allowed to recognize him. Urbano Lazzaro, one of the chiefs of the brigade, related later that he identified him by the facial structure and the gaze, despite the helmet and the military coat. Mussolini was conducted initially to the town hall of Dongo, where a custody room was improvised. There he remained under guard while the partisans decided what to do with him. In parallel, Clara Petacci was also detained and transferred to the same place. She had travelled in a separate automobile, but had insisted on accompanying Mussolini at all times. In the subsequent hours, the partisans proceeded to identify the other prisoners captured in the convoy. Among them were found prominent figures of the Italian Social Republic, like Alessandro Pavolini, Fernando Mezzasoma, Paolo Zerbino, and Luigi Gatti. These men were retained together with Mussolini and became part of the internal negotiation about the destiny of the fascist hierarchs. Faced with the risk that the German forces would try to liberate Mussolini, the partisans decided to transfer him to a more secure place. That same night, he was taken to the locality of Mezzegra, near Dongo, situated also on the western bank of the Lake of Como. For the transport were used civilian vehicles guarded by armed partisans. In Mezzegra, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were lodged in different houses of local peasants, which were requisitioned for that purpose. The partisans chose secluded dwellings to make the location of the prisoners difficult. According to later testimonies, Mussolini remained in silence during the transfer and did not show physical resistance. The custody was in charge of communist partisans, some of them belonging to the group directed by Walter Audicio, who, at that moment, was still in Milan, but who would soon be sent with precise orders about the destiny of the prisoner. Various testimonies of those who were near Mussolini in Dongo and Mezzegra coincide in pointing out that he was in a state of general dejection. The reports mention that he spoke little, barely ate, and spent most of the time seated in silence. Some affirmed that he seemed disconnected from what was happening around him, as if he were resigned. Other witnesses pointed out that at specific moments he expressed incredulity about his situation and asked about the possibility of being handed over to the Allies instead of remaining under partisan custody. There are no records of escape attempts or physical resistance on his part. Clara Petacci, in contrast, showed herself active in his defense. According to some partisans, she intervened several times to ask that they not separate Mussolini from her and to request better custody conditions. Her insistence kept her at his side on several occasions, although the guards had initially thought of separating them. The capture of Mussolini generated an immediate debate within the Committee of National Liberation of Upper Italy, with headquarters in Milan. The CLNAY was composed of representatives of the main currents of the resistance: communists, socialists, Christian Democrats, liberals, and of justice and liberty. The main question was to decide what to do with Mussolini and the other captured hierarchs. There existed several options: to hand him over to the Allies, who in those days were advancing toward the north, to try him in a public process under the control of the CLNA1, or to execute him in a summary manner without a formal process. Each alternative had political and military implications. The handover to the Allies could weaken the authority of the resistance before the Italian population. A public trial was seen as risky, since it would require time, logistics, and security at a moment when the war was still active. The immediate execution was defended by the communist sectors, who considered that an exemplary sanction should be applied without delay. The deliberation was carried out on the night of the 27th to the 28th of April. The General Secretary of the Italian Communist Party, Luigi Longo, together with Sandro Pertini, of socialist orientation, and other leaders, participated in the discussions. Finally, it was agreed that Mussolini should be executed without a trial. The decision was communicated to the partisan commands in the area of the Lake of Como. On the morning of the 28th of April, the partisan Walter Audicio, known by the war name Colonel Valerio, departed from Milan toward Dongo with the mission of executing the decision of the CLNA-1. He was accompanied by other militants, among them Aldo Lampredi, a communist leader and liaison of the committee in the region. Audicio carried written instructions that authorized him to act in the name of the CLNA-1. According to his own testimony, he also received a pistol and a submachine gun to carry out the order. Upon his arrival in Dongo and subsequently in Mezzegra, he assumed the custody of Mussolini and Clara Petacci. Despite the official version transmitted by Audicio and Lampredi, the topic of who gave the definitive order to execute Mussolini has been the object of historical controversy. Some documents maintain that the decision came directly from the CLNA-1 in Milan. Others suggest that it was a local initiative of the partisan commanders of the area who considered it impossible to guarantee a trial or a safe transfer of the prisoner. Another version affirms that the order was communicated to Audicio by Luigi Longo in person, while some researchers posit that Palmiro Togliatti, secretary of the Italian Communist Party in Moscow, would have intervened in the decision through messages transmitted by radio. The diversity of testimonies and the lack of unified documents has kept the debate open about the authorship of the order. What is indisputable is that, by the afternoon of the 28th of April, the decision was taken and would be executed in a matter of hours. In the afternoon of the 28th of April, Audicio ordered the transfer of Mussolini and Clara Petacci from their place of custody in Mezzegra toward a point previously chosen for the execution. The vehicle used was a Fiat 1100, driven by a local partisan. The destination was the Villa Belmonte in the hamlet of Giulino di Mezzegra, where it had been arranged to carry out the action. Mussolini and Petacci were placed in the back seat. During the journey, according to the account of Audicio, the Duce remained in silence while Clara Petacci held his hand. The automobile stopped in front of the stone wall of the Villa Belmonte. There, in an isolated space, it was arranged that the order of the Committee of National Liberation be fulfilled. Villa Belmonte, the day the Duce fell under the bullets. In the afternoon of the 28th of April of 1945, Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci were taken out of their custody in Mezzegra and conducted in an automobile Fiat 1100 toward the nearby locality of Giulino di Mezzegra. The vehicle was driven by a local partisan, while Walter Audicio, known as Colonel Valerio, travelled in the front seat. In the back part were Mussolini and Petacci, flanked by other armed partisans. The choice of the place was not arbitrary. The Villa Belmonte, a private residence situated in the hamlet of Giulino, offered an isolated stone wall next to a little transited road. The site was considered adequate to carry out the order of execution because it allowed to act with rapidity, without direct witnesses, and with low risk of external intervention. The journey from Mezzegra was short. During the trip, according to the later testimony of Audicio, Mussolini did not pronounce words. Other accounts indicate that he kept his head down and that he did not show physical resistance. Clara Petacci remained beside him, taking his hand. The automobile stopped in front of the stone wall of the Villa Belmonte toward 16 hours. Audicio ordered Mussolini and Petacci to descend. Around there was a small group of partisans, but not a crowd. The operation was carried out with discretion, fulfilling the instruction to execute the order in an immediate manner. According to the account of Aldo Lampredi, present at the place, the prisoners were placed in front of the wall at a few meters of distance. Mussolini remained immobile. Clara Petacci, on the other hand, protested against the decision to shoot him and tried to interpose herself, begging the partisans to forgive him. Audicio declared later that, before opening fire, he read to the prisoners a communiqué that represented the decision of the Committee of National Liberation of Upper Italy. The text summarized the condemnation of fascism and its leader, establishing that the execution was carried out in the name of the Italian people. Some historians have cast doubt that said reading was effected at that moment. Aldo Lampredi, in his memoirs, maintained that no formal sentence was read and that the order was fulfilled in a direct manner, without ceremonies. This discrepancy constitutes one of the controversial points of the reconstruction. The testimonies differ regarding the behavior of Mussolini in his last moments. According to the version of Walter Audicio, The ex-dictator was dejected, could barely stay on his feet, and did not pronounce relevant words. According to him, he did not even look at the platoon and let himself be placed in front of the wall without resistance. The version of Aldo Lampredi maintains that Mussolini was serene, without trembling, and that he accepted his destiny in silence. For Lampredi, the image transmitted by Audicio of a defeated man did not correspond with what he observed. Other local versions transmitted the idea that Mussolini asked that they shoot him in the heart, although this affirmation has never been able to be proven. The lack of a single record has generated a historiographical debate that is maintained until the present about the final disposition of the fascist leader. The figure of Clara Petacci in the last minutes is also surrounded by divergent versions. According to some partisans, she tried to interpose herself physically between Mussolini and the weapons of the executioners, embracing him and shouting that they not kill him. In that version, she threw herself on him at the very moment of the execution and was hit by the bullets. Other sources point out that although she cried and protested, she did not get to pounce but simply asked to be shot together with him. This second version describes that she accepted to remain at his side in the final instant. What is not in doubt is that Petacci was executed together with Mussolini, although she had no official charges nor was part of the apparatus of the state. Her presence was due exclusively to her decision to accompany him. Towards 16 hours with 10 minutes, Audicio raised his submachine gun MAS-38 and opened fire. According to his account, the first bursts did not work due to a jam, so he took another weapon and fired at Mussolini at short distance. The body of the Duce collapsed against the stone wall. Almost simultaneously, Clara Petacci was hit by the shots and fell beside him. The exact number of impacts was never established with certainty, but the later autopsies registered multiple firearm wounds in both bodies. The rest of the partisans present secured the area and confirmed the death of the prisoners. The bodies were left lying for a brief period of time before being loaded again into the automobile. Although the official version of the Italian Communist Party recognized Walter Audicio as the executioner, with the support of Aldo Lampredi as a witness, with time other hypotheses arose. Some partisan veterans affirmed that it was another combatant, Michele Moretti, who fired the first shots. Others maintained that Audicio acted as a political representative of the CLN-A1, but that the concrete action was carried out by more than one shooter. Later investigations have also raised the possibility that the decision was taken in a more local and improvised manner, although without conclusive documentary evidence. The multiplicity of versions reflects the lack of a unified record and the difficulty of reconstructing an episode that occurred in a war environment with dispersed witnesses and partial documents. Once the death was verified, the partisans loaded the bodies of Mussolini and Petacci into the Fiat 1100. The operation was carried out with rapidity, since the objective was to transfer them toward Milan to present them publicly as a symbol of the end of fascism. At the place remained only traces of blood and remains of casings. The presence of neighbors or civilian witnesses was not allowed, with the aim of maintaining control of the narrative about the event. Piazzale Loreto, the vengeance of the people against fascism. After the execution in Giulino di Mezzegra, the afternoon of the 28th of April of 1945, the bodies of Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci were loaded into a vehicle by the partisans. The decision of the Committee of National Liberation of Upper Italy was to expose them in Milan, the main industrial city of the north and the neuralgic center of fascism since its origins. Together with the corpses of the Duce and of Petacci were also placed the bodies of other hierarchs of the Italian Social Republic who had been executed in Dongo, among them Alessandro Pavolini, Achille Starace, and other leaders. In total, the caravan included more than a dozen bodies. The convoy undertook the journey from the Lake of Como toward Milan on the night of the 28th and the early morning of the 29th of April. The bodies, according to later testimonies, were partially covered with tarps or blankets, although in some cases they remained visible. The journey was slow, given that they were crossing roads with numerous partisan controls and transit zones of retreating troops. At dawn of the 29th of April, the vehicles with the corpses entered the city. Milan had been declared liberated days before, after the insurrection of the 25th of April. The climate was of celebration, with thousands of people in the streets and partisan patrols deployed at different points. The convoy headed directly to the Loreto Square, a wide esplanade situated in the northeast of the city. The choice of the place was not casual. In August of 1944, 15 partisans had been shot there by order of the fascist authorities and their bodies exposed publicly for hours. That episode had deeply marked the collective memory of the Milanese. Around 9 in the morning, the corpses were unloaded in the square and thrown on the ground in front of the Esso gas station located on one of the corners. The first to approach were passers-by who had seen the movement of trucks. Upon recognizing the bodies, the news spread with rapidity. Soon a crowd of several thousand people gathered. The partisans who had placed the bodies on the ground in a row did not try to impede the approach of the public. Many citizens, upon confirming the identity of Mussolini and of his main collaborators, began to manifest in a noisy way. The concentration grew with rapidity until it filled the entire square. As the crowd increased, the first acts of violence against the bodies began. Various witnesses registered that the corpses were kicked, spat upon, beaten with sticks and stones. Some were dragged on the ground. In particular, the body of Mussolini received repeated physical attacks that disfigured it. The partisans present did not intervene to stop these actions. According to some reports, they considered that the reaction was part of the collective settling of accounts after 20 years of dictatorship and 2 years of civil war. Other witnesses pointed out that the magnitude of the crowd made it impossible to control access. The body of Clara Petacci was also assaulted, although to a lesser extent. Several photographs show her corpse next to that of Mussolini, with visible signs of blows. Toward midday, the partisan leaders in the square decided to hang the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and several more hierarchs on a metallic structure of the Esso gas station. The measure sought to elevate the corpses and prevent the crowd from destroying them completely on the ground. Iron hooks that normally served to hang spare parts and tires were used. The bodies were hoisted by the feet, head down, in a row. The images captured by photographers at that moment show Mussolini and Petacci in the center, surrounded by other executed ones. The chosen method also had a strong symbolic component. During the years of the Republic of Salo, the fascists had hung in the same square the bodies of murdered partisans, in particular the 15th of August of 1944. The repetition of the gesture in the inverse sense reinforced the public dimension of the act. During the entire day of the 29th of April, thousands of people went to Piazzale Loreto. The photographs and films of the era show a varied crowd: partisans, civilians, women, children, onlookers, and press photographers. The scene became a point of concentration in Milan. Expressions of jubilation, songs, insults, and spontaneous manifestations were registered. Some witnesses related that people threw objects against the hanging corpses, while others simply observed. The concentration lasted for hours and only dispersed late in the afternoon when the authorities of the CLNAY ordered the removal of the bodies. As the day progressed, leaders of the CLNAY and partisan commands began to worry about the magnitude of the spectacle. They feared that the situation would get out of control and damage the image of the liberation on the international level. Finally, in the afternoon of the 29th, it was ordered to lower the bodies and transfer them to the Institute of Legal Medicine of Milan. There, basic autopsies were performed to confirm the cause of death. The medical examination established that Mussolini had received multiple bullet impacts in the torso and the head. The corpse of Clara Petacci also presented several firearm wounds. The bodies were placed in simple coffins and deposited in dependencies of the Institute, awaiting new decisions about their burial. The public exhibition of the bodies in Piazzale Loreto was registered by numerous photographers and cameramen, which ensured a wide dissemination of the images. In a matter of days, the photographs circulated through Europe and were reproduced in newspapers of different countries. The place acquired a strong symbolic charge. For many Italians, it represented the exact inversion of what happened in 1944, when the partisans were executed there by order of the fascists. The square thus became a point of memory of the Italian Civil War and of the defeat of fascism. The exhibition generated different reactions inside and outside of Italy. Among the inhabitants of Milan and of other cities of the north, the manifestations in Piazzale Loreto were seen as an expression of the closing of a cycle of violence. However, some political and diplomatic sectors abroad criticized the public character of the spectacle. In the following days, the Allied press published the images. The military and political leaders of the United States and Great Britain manifested concern about the negative impact they could have on international public opinion. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, highlighted the scene as an example of popular justice. The echo of the end, Hitler and the shadow of Mussolini. The 29th of April of 1945, after the exhibition of the bodies in Piazzale Loreto, the news of the execution of Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci spread rapidly within Italy. The radio controlled by the partisans announced the event with brief messages that confirmed the death of the Duce and of his collaborators. In Milan, Turin, and Genoa, the information circulated by word of mouth among the population, accompanied by rumors and details not always precise. The photographers present in the square distributed the first images among local press agencies. The negatives were sent to newspapers in the north of Italy that were already being printed under the control of the liberation committees. In a matter of hours, the news had surpassed the local sphere and began to be transmitted abroad through Allied war correspondents present in the area. The 29th of April in the afternoon, the Allied military authorities in Italy received official reports from the Italian resistance about the execution of Mussolini. These reports included photographs and descriptions of the events in Piazzale Loreto. General Harold Alexander, Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean, transmitted the information to the General Headquarters in London and Washington. The content was confirmed by international agencies like Reuters and Associated Press, which distributed cables with details of the death of the Italian dictator. The British and the American government published brief communiques highlighting the definitive fall of the fascist regime. In Washington, President Harry Truman limited himself to pointing out that the end of Mussolini was a symbol of the collapse of the Axis in Europe. In those same days, Berlin was under the final siege of the Red Army. The 25th of April, the Soviet troops had surrounded the city and reached the River Spree. The 28th of April, units of the 3rd Soviet Shock Army were entering the governmental district. Adolf Hitler was secluded in the Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery. From there, he directed what remained of the military operations, although the situation was critical and irreversible. Communication with the exterior was limited and depended on messengers and fragmentary radio transmissions. The information about the death of Mussolini reached the bunker between the 29th and the 30th of April, when several officers communicated to him the reports received through international agencies and the Swiss radio. The testimonies of those who remained in the bunker coincide in pointing out that the news of the execution and the public exhibition of Mussolini deeply affected Hitler. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, registered in his diaries that the Führer was impacted upon learning that the corpse of his ally had been hung in a public square. General Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of the defense of the governmental district, related after the war that Hitler reacted with fury and expressed his determination not to allow his own body to suffer a similar destiny. Martin Bormann, personal secretary of the Führer, confirmed in later communications that the dictator ordered to prepare fuels to incinerate his corpse in case of death. In practice, the news reinforced a decision that Hitler had already considered, to commit suicide to avoid falling prisoner of the Soviets. What was new was the explicit instruction that his body had to be destroyed immediately to prevent any public exhibition. The testimonies of those who remained in the bunker coincide in pointing out that the news of the execution and the public exhibition of Mussolini deeply affected Hitler. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, registered in his diaries that the Führer was impacted upon learning that the corpse of his ally had been hung in a public square. General Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of the defense of the governmental district, related after the war that Hitler reacted with fury and expressed his determination not to allow his own body to suffer a similar destiny. Martin Bormann, personal secretary of the Führer, confirmed in later communications that the dictator ordered to prepare fuels to incinerate his corpse in case of death. In practice, the news reinforced a decision that Hitler had already considered, to commit suicide to avoid falling prisoner of the Soviets. What was new was the explicit instruction that his body had to be destroyed immediately to prevent any public exhibition. The 30th of April in the morning, Hitler summoned his closest staff and reiterated the order. After his suicide, the body had to be sprayed with gasoline and burned in the garden of the Chancellery. The chief of the personal escort, Otto Günscher, received the responsibility of organizing the procedure. The news of the execution of Mussolini also influenced the rest of the Nazi hierarchs who remained in Berlin. Joseph Goebbels, after learning of the death of his ally, declared to his close circle that he had no intention of surviving Hitler nor of surrendering to the Soviets. The 1st of May, one day after the suicide of the Führer, Goebbels took his own life together with his wife Magda after poisoning their 6 children. Other hierarchs adopted similar attitudes. Heinrich Himmler, who had tried to negotiate with the Western Allies, committed suicide shortly after being captured by British troops. Hermann Göring, upon receiving news of the suicide of Hitler and of the execution of Mussolini, tried to escape, but was also arrested and tried in Nuremberg. The images of Piazzale Loreto circulated rapidly outside of Italy. British, French, and American newspapers published the photographs in the first days of May of 1945. In many cases, the bodies were shown hanging at the gas station with feet upwards and surrounded by a crowd. The Soviet press also reproduced the images, highlighting the exemplary character of the scene. In Moscow, the newspaper Pravda underlined that was the destiny of the fascist leaders. In contrast, in some Western countries, criticisms arose about the crudeness of the exhibition. Editorials of British newspapers pointed out that the spectacle could tarnish the image of the Italian liberation. In the United States, although the news was published widely, some images were softened or not reproduced in their entirety. The execution of Mussolini and the subsequent death of Hitler, which occurred barely 2 days later, symbolically marked the end of the Axis in Europe. For contemporaries, the parallelism between both events was evident. The first publicly executed, the second destroying his own body to prevent a similar outcome. In Allied propaganda, the temporal coincidence reinforced the idea that the totalitarian regimes had reached their end. In Italy, the exhibition in Piazzale Loreto was seen as the confirmation that fascism had ended in a definitive manner. In Germany, the incineration of the corpse of Hitler was known later, but with the same meaning, the physical disappearance of the leader as a symbol of the defeat. The Dark Legacy, the last resting place of the Duce. After the public exhibition in Piazzale Loreto, the 29th of April of 1945, the bodies of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and several fascist hierarchs were transferred to the Institute of Legal Medicine of Milan. Their autopsies were performed with the aim of officially certifying the cause of death. The examination confirmed that Mussolini had received multiple bullet impacts, while the body of Petacci presented similar wounds. Once the studies were concluded, the problem arose of where to bury the remains. The authorities of the Committee of National Liberation of Upper Italy feared that the tomb would become a point of pilgrimage for fascist sympathizers. For that reason, it was decided to give the bodies a discreet destination. The corpse of Mussolini was placed in a wooden coffin and transferred in secret to the Maggiore cemetery of Milan. There it was buried in a nameless tomb, in a space destined for deceased without clear identification. Only a small group of authorities knew the exact location. The objective was to prevent the place from becoming a site of political homage. The 23rd of April of 1946, a few days before the first anniversary of his execution, a group of neo-fascist militants led by Domenico Lecisi, a former member of the Republican Guard, organized a clandestine operation to recover the body of Mussolini. Lecisi and his collaborators entered at night into the Maggiore cemetery and located the anonymous tomb where the corpse was deposited. They opened the coffin, removed the remains, and transferred them outside the cemetery. The theft was discovered the following morning when the caretakers found the grave empty. The event provoked a national scandal. The Italian government, presided at that moment by Alcide de Gasperi, ordered an immediate investigation. The authorities feared that the body would be used for propagandistic purposes by neo-fascist groups in a political context still unstable, since the referendum on the monarchy and the republic was scheduled for June of 1946. For several months, the whereabouts of the corpse was a mystery. The authorities carried out raids in neo-fascist circles and detained suspects, but without immediate results. Meanwhile, rumors circulated about its transfer abroad or its concealment in private houses. Finally, in August of 1946, the police discovered that the body was in a Capuchin convent in the locality of Cerro Maggiore near Milan. The friars had received the corpse in a clandestine manner and kept it hidden in a metallic chest, under a slab in the floor of an internal dependency. The finding was communicated to the authorities, who took charge again of the remains. The government decided to keep the place of custody secret to avoid new profanations. During the following 11 years, the corpse remained under the control of the state without being handed over to the family. In the decade of 1950, the Mussolini family, headed by the widow Rachele Guidi and by her son Romano, requested on repeated occasions the return of the body to give it burial in Predappio, the dictator's native locality. The Italian government showed itself reticent for years, fearing that the transfer could revive neo-fascist manifestations. The debate intensified in 1956 when the press revealed the existence of the corpse in the hands of the state. The news generated political controversy. Sectors of the right demanded its delivery to the family, while parties of the left denounced the risk of turning Predappio into a place of fascist cult. In 1957, after prolonged discussions, the government of Oddone Zoli authorized the delivery of the remains. The decision was adopted under the condition that the tomb would remain under state control and that official political acts would not be permitted in its surroundings. The 31st of August of 1957, the body of Mussolini was transferred to Predappio and buried in the family crypt of the cemetery of San Cassiano. The ceremony was carried out in a private manner, with the presence of close relatives and without official honors. Despite the restrictions, the burial attracted numerous sympathizers who came spontaneously. From that moment, Predappio became a place of periodic pilgrimage for groups of neo-fascist orientation. The tomb was conditioned with marble and a tombstone with the inscription Benito Mussolini, 1883-11945. In its interior, the remains were deposited in a sarcophagus visible through a grille. Access was regulated by the local authorities, who permitted visits on determined dates. With the passing of the years, the burial in Predappio was the object of several incidents. The most significant occurred in December of 1971, when an explosive device placed in the crypt seriously damaged the structure. Although the explosion did not reach the remains, it caused destruction in the chapel and forced the reinforcement of security measures. Other minor attempts of profanation or vandalism were registered in the subsequent decades, which forced the authorities to maintain constant vigilance around the place. Since its definitive burial, the body of Mussolini has been the object of conflicting interpretations in Italian society. For sectors of the radical right, the tomb of Predappio became a symbolic point of reference. Each year, on dates like the 28th of April, the anniversary of the execution, or the 29th of July, the date of birth, neo-fascist groups organized pilgrimages and concentrations in the locality. In contrast, for broad sectors of Italian society, the memory of Mussolini was linked with repression, war, and dictatorship. In that sense, the presence of his tomb in Predappio was considered a political problem that kept alive an uncomfortable symbol of the past. The local authorities tried to manage the phenomenon. Predappio was transformed into a destination of political and historical tourism, with visitors who came both for academic interest and for ideological motives. Souvenir shops began to sell objects with fascist iconography, generating national and international controversy. In post-war Italy, the figure of Mussolini was marked by political division. While the Constitution of 1948 established the illegality of the apology of fascism, reality showed that there existed social and political currents that kept alive the memory of the Duce in a vindicatory sense. Predappio became the stage where these tensions manifested with greater clarity. On certain dates, the neo-fascist concentrations gathered thousands of people under police surveillance. In parallel, associations of ex-partisan combatants and anti-fascist organizations carried out acts of remembrance in honor of the victims of the regime. This contrast evidenced the difficulty of Italy to construct a unified memory about the dictatorship and the civil war. While in other European countries the defeated leaders were quickly relegated to a generalized rejection, in Italy the memory of Mussolini remained active in a significant minority. The history of the corpse of the Duce thus became a reflection of the unresolved fractures of Italian society, where the physical death of the dictator did not manage to completely close the debate about his historical legacy and his place in the collective memory.